Welcome everybody to the last session of the 2021 virtual VSSA. Gosh, this just flew by. I can't believe it. But as you know, it's a Friday, which means we're talking about the MD PhD path. And it's our last week, which means, we've kind of given you a preview about what MD PhD structures are like and why you'd want to go into this kind of program. Then we've explored some personal journeys of people who are going through this path and who have finished this path and what their life actually looks like. And then now that you know that this is what you want to do, we really want to make sure that we help you on your path and help give you some information in applying and admissions and what that actually looks like and how to actually stand out. So I am thrilled to welcome back Dr. Megan Williams, who is the Assistant Director of the Vanderbilt MSTP program, the Medical Scientist Training Program, or MD PhD program. And she is the expert. She knows what admissions committees look like, how to apply, and just has a ton of wonderful tips and tricks to share with you. So thank you so much, Megan, for being here. It's an honor and can't wait to hear your talk.
Great, thank you, Beth. I'm looking forward to speaking with all of you. Let me get my screen. Everyone can see that? All
Looks
right, great.
perfect. Yep.
Awesome. Okay, so I am happy to take questions, of course, in the chat or out loud at the end. Either way, I have a lot of kind of details on my slides because I really wanted to make sure that we covered everything and you had all of the information. But unfortunately, they're kind of boring without a lot of pictures because I wanted all the words on there. So bear with me with that. And like I said, happy to answer any questions you have about this process. I just wanted to start with a brief reminder. These are things that we covered way back in the first week, but hopefully throughout the summer you've learned a lot about MD PhD programs and why you might want to pursue an MD PhD program. But just to sort of recap, why we think physician scientists and MD PhD trained physician scientists are really important. And physician scientists essentially are biomedical researchers who are going to help treat and or help uncover information that could hopefully treat or cure even human disease. And so that's really kind of the goal. But one reason that we think that it's really important to have MD PhDs versus maybe just, and I don't mean just as a bad thing, but just PhD trained biomedical scientists is that MD PhDs are really able to work in the lab and in the clinic and cross this divide that we sometimes call the bench to bedside abyss. So the idea that sometimes we have trouble translating our research that we do in the lab to be able to be directly relatable to helping patients in the clinic. And sometimes even with physicians who might not have the scientific training, they know that there are issues in the clinic and want to have better ways to treat their patients, but aren't always able to then translate that back into maybe a research project that could help treat their patients in the future. And so this is really where we feel like physician scientists can play a role in helping to bridge this gap. So if you think that sounds like you, that's great. Physician scientists are people who are trained as both physicians and scientific investigators, and they're often going to spend more of their professional time doing research just because of the nature of the time that it takes to have an active, successful research program. But they also are people that get very excited about seeing patients in the clinic and helping to serve and treat their patients as well. And they can have a variety of careers. The most common one is to probably work at a place like Vanderbilt, where you have medical school, hospital, an academic research institution all on one. But there's a lot of other areas they can do as well. And there's this little tagline that I like at the bottom here that I think really describes kind of the goal of these types of careers. And the idea is that they're treating today's patients in the clinic, and then they're treating tomorrow's patients through research that they do in their lab. And I think that's really the goal of a physician scientist and why they want to go into these careers. So if this sounds like you, what do you do to get into MD PhD programs? The first step, I'm going to start kind of at the beginning. I know some people might know more or less about this, so I wanted to be pretty thorough. But the first step is that most MD PhD programs use the AMCAS application which is the medical school application. It's often sometimes referred to as the primary application as well. This is one central application that the CAS part of AMCAS actually is Central Application System. It's a central application that all of your schools that you apply to are going to receive. So it's generic information about you and why you want to do this. AMCAS opens in May for you to start working on, and then you can submit at the end of May. And then what happens is AMCAS actually will take up to 4 to 6 weeks to verify the information that you've submitted. And most of that has to do with transcripts and how they convert grades and transcripts into a central kind of GPA um, standard so that all students, depending or are have their GPAs viewed the same. So schools have different criteria, whether they use pluses and minuses and greater than 4.0 scales and different things like that. And so AMCAS converts those all and verifies your application. And that can take some time. And then after AMCAS verifies your application, schools will receive them. And the earliest that a school will receive anybody's application, even if they submit the very first day that's possible, is the end of June. This means if you're applying May or June or July, you're applying a whole year in advance, maybe even a little more than a year in advance of when you actually are anticipating attending an MD-PhD program. Um, Also, schools typically have rolling admissions. So these timelines, when I talk about June and July, but you might not see deadlines until October or November. And that is true that you don't have to submit your application until those deadlines. But most schools with rolling admissions will review applications in the order that they come in and give interview invitations in the order that they come in. And sometimes even accept people in the order that they're interviewed. And so that often means that they get a little bit pickier with their interview invitations later in the season because they don't have as many interview spots available. So it is definitely to your advantage to apply earlier, closer to when the application opens, rather than later, closer to when you see those deadlines. The AMCAS application will consist of a lot of your background information, kind of biographical information about you, that type of information. And then there's also this really large works and activities section. And this is also called like your experiences. And you get to list 15 experiences. You can think of this almost as like your CV or your resume, right? It's all the things that you've done that you want to tell us about. And it can include things such as extracurricular activities, athletics, organizations that you're in, work experiences, clinical experiences like shadowing or volunteering, non clinical volunteering, leadership, research, awards, presentations, publications. There's a lot of different categories of what you can list here. And you might think once you start listing it that you have more than 15. And so that's up to you to figure out, what are the 15 things that are most important for us to know. Sometimes you can group some presentations or publications or honors and awards together if you're running short on space. And you'll also be allowed to select the 3 most meaningful experiences. And all of your experiences will allow you to say a couple sentences about them. But the 3 most meaningful will allow you to expand and have more of like a thorough paragraph about that experience. And so it's really important that you select those carefully. Another thing in AMCAS that's really helpful is when you're describing your experiences to us, um, instead of just describing it and saying, I volunteered at this position for 4 hours a week and this is what I did. Think really reflectively about what types of skills or experiences you've like learned from that you think you can carry over into your career as a physician scientist, because that's really what we want to know. How did this experience benefit you? What did you learn? How are you going to translate that to your future career? So please try to think about that as you're filling out those AMCAS sections. As I mentioned earlier, you'll also submit your transcripts to AMCAS as well. In addition to that background information and your experiences, AMCAS also has some essays. So there's the personal comments essay, which is often referred to as the personal statement for medical school. And I've just listed here the prompts that the actual essay from AMCAS gives you. Um, and I think it's important to read these and, answer these questions as much as possible. These are the types of things you want to consider when you're filling out your AMCAS essay. And definitely, be sure to read these things at the bottom and include hardships, challenges, anything like that that you think we need to know. You want to look at these essays, thinking that this is at this point the only thing we have about you is what's in your AMCAS application. And so if we're deciding to offer you a secondary, this is all we're going to know. So you want to tell us as much as you possibly can, even though it's a shorter essay. So these are all the things, the types of things you might want to think about. One tip here is, I know all of these prompts are about medicine, right? Why do you want to go into medicine? What motivates you about medicine? What do you want medical schools to know? But if you're applying to MD PhD programs, it can be really helpful to have a small amount of information in here about, why you also like research and why you think that's important for medicine, and why you want to be a physician scientist, so that it's not just focused on medicine, and then the admissions committee might be, like wondering if you really do want to do research or really as interested in the science part as well. So I think that can be a good tip to do if you're applying to MD PhD programs. Um, so that personal statement is for all medical school applicants will do. However, if you're applying to MD PhD programs, you do have two additional essays that you'll complete as part of the AMCAS application. And the first one is an MD PhD essay, which essentially is, why do you want to do MD PhD? How can this program be the best fit for your career goals rather than maybe just an MD or just a PhD program? And this essay is a little bit shorter. It's 3,000 characters is their limit. It's not as long as the personal statement limit. And then you'll also be asked about your total hours of research experience. And we'll talk more about what we're looking for with research experience later on. You will also be asked to highlight your research experience in a significant research experience essay. And this essay is pretty long, it's up to 10,000 characters. And so here we really want you to explain to us the research that you've done in your different experiences. How long was it? What was your project like? What happened? What was the hypothesis and the experiments and the conclusions? What were your contributions? Kind of outline all of that for us. And you might have many different experiences, might a lot of things. If you're trying to narrow it down, try it and can't fit it, do really the things that are most longitudinal, most impactful for you. It can also be helpful in this essay to have a slight narrative, as you explain how you went from maybe lab to lab or project to project, talking about some of those transitions and what you learned from your experiences instead of just simply talking purely about the research project. It can make it a little bit more exciting to read and give the reader more insight into your research experience as well. So that is the AMCAS application. As I mentioned, all schools will receive all of that information. So it should be general enough to address all of your schools. Then you'll often be invited to complete a secondary application. These are usually additional questions that each school wants. They're often essays, but also some additional information as well. Um, for AMCAS, you pay fees directly to AMCAS, and you do have to pay fees related to the number of programs you're applying to. There's usually like an included amount, and then other programs are extra. AMCAS does have a fee assistance program, and so you should definitely consider looking into that if that's something that you might qualify for and apply. And I know in the last year or two, because of COVID, they've been a little more lenient with their criteria for that. So that's something to think about if you think you might qualify, and the cost of applying is going to be a hindrance for you. Unfortunately, secondary applications also usually have a fee that you have to pay for each school. Um, Luckily, Vanderbilt's secondary application for MD PhD programs does not have a fee. So that's really great information. But also ask programs about fee waivers. If you've qualified for the AMCAS fee assistance program, you usually get a fee waiver for your secondary applications as well. If you didn't qualify, but it's still going to be financially difficult for you to pay all these fees, ask programs. That you can always ask and be told that that's not something that they offer. But at some schools, just asking will sometimes get you the fee waiver. Sometimes participating in conferences and different experiences like that will get you the fee waiver. So if you interact with programs at conferences, ask them if that's something that they have. So be sure to ask about that. Then these applications, the secondary application deadlines are also school specific because they're school specific applications. Vanderbilt's is December 1st. But again, if you've submitted your primary application in July and received an invite for the secondary, don't wait until December 1st. You should probably complete that within a few weeks, so that schools can move on with the review of your application. Most schools won't review your application until they received all of the components of it. These are the Vanderbilt secondary application questions. These are three essays that we require. And the goal of these questions is really to learn more about you, to learn about how we think you will be a good fit for our medical school and what you'll bring to our program in our medical school. You want to tell us different information than you've already told us. It's true that you might reference experiences you've talked about before, but we already, have your AMCAS application, and we want to learn new information about you. So really think about how you can expand and explain something new to us through these essays. And it's to get to know you better, to get to understand your motivations, how you work with others, how you're going to be in our program. That's what these essays are hopefully designed to learn about you. Then there's a few additional questions. So we have just an optional one where we want to know what you've been doing since you graduated. Sometimes you don't know that when you submitted your primary, because if you've just graduated in May and then you're submitting your secondary application, or sorry, your primary application like a couple weeks later, you might not have a plan set up yet. So we certainly want to know if you've graduated, what you've been doing since graduation. If you're still an undergrad, no worries. We know that's what you're doing. So that's why that one's optional. We also have an optional essay that we added last year that we're going to keep for the future until it's essentially no longer necessary. But this allows you to explain anything. I think it says 200 words for the COVID one. I think it's 500 words. Sorry about that. But to explain anything that you might have impacted your plans due to COVID. So if things got canceled, if you weren't able to get as much shadowing as you were planning, different things like that, or any kind of impacts this may have had on you or your application, and that you want us to know about. So this is optional. You might say, yeah, I've already told you all these things. I don't have anything to add. It's totally fine. Or you might have some really important things that you want us to know that you have not yet told us. And so please use this to let us know that information. For MD PhD applicants, we also include this section that we call original works, which is essentially like your abstracts, publications, presentations. It's just a way to put all of those in one space for us to see. And then sometimes you might have had changes or updates to these things since your primary application. And so this will allow you to include additional information there. Another thing, since I just mentioned the changes idea, Vanderbilt accepts updates at any time throughout the application cycle. So some schools might have different rules on how they handle updates, but we do accept updates at any point. And so if you've got something that changed status like a publication, or you didn't have a research or shadowing position or something when you submitted your application, but now you do and you want us to know about that, you can certainly let us know at any point as you apply. So that's kind of the process. I'm going to go through now a little bit on, what do we look at when we look at your application? What are the types of things that we'll use to actually evaluate your application? One of the most important things for MD PhD applicants is research experience. We are going to spend a lot of time and money essentially training you to be a physician scientist. And that means that you're going to hopefully have a career where you're going to be heavily invested in a research based career. Because of that, we want to make sure that you are really excited about that research and that you want that career. So we'll look at your application to make sure that you've got research experience to help you understand that. Um, People often ask, how many hours do I need? How much research experience do I need? And there really isn't like a magic number here. It's hard because everybody's experiences are different. I think some of the things that we look for, we really want you, as I mentioned, to understand what you're getting into. You should, know what a research career is like. Oftentimes, this might be multiple summer projects, undergraduate research, maybe a senior research thesis. If you weren't able to get that kind of research experience in undergrad, or you went to a small liberal arts college that just doesn't offer that kind of research, then that's where oftentimes people will take a gap year or two and spend some time pursuing research after undergrad. Um, I'm going to quit sharing slides here for a minute because I noticed that you can't actually see what it says. Um, so let me change this. Okay. So the types of things that you might consider doing during gap years. Um, Actually, I'm going to step back a second. But that's where you might consider, if you didn't get that research experience, you might consider taking some time off. Something that we'll look for in your research experience is, did you were you able to test a hypothesis, work through a project? Did you ultimately gain independence? It's a lot easier to enjoy research when you're just basically doing what people tell you to do. It's a little bit more complicated when you're having to work through the challenges and the failures, and that's when you really, really learn, what it's like and if that's something that you want to do. We often get this question, should you take time off after undergrad or should you just apply directly from undergrad? Do I need to take a gap year? Comments like that. It is true that over the last 5 years or so, the people entering MD PhD programs have been more increasingly taking gap years. I don't know that that's necessarily because it's necessary or if it's because the way that people have been advised or students are just choosing to do that. The kind of the idea of whether you need one or not really depends on your specific circumstances. So if you have done research for a lot of years in undergrad, you knew about MD PhD programs and had time to prepare for this pathway, you're sure that this is what you want to do, and you've done the types of things you need to do to prepare, then great, you can be ready to apply directly after or in your junior, the summer after your junior year to matriculate directly after undergrad. However, if you came to research late because you thought maybe you weren't going to like it, or you were just interested in medical school, or you didn't even really know that MD PhD programs were a thing until later on, or you're not sure exactly what you want to do, and you need a little more time to figure that out, or you didn't have time to take the courses that you needed to take and take the MCAT and be ready to apply, or you just want some time off because you're just, you just need another year, that's all totally fine. And that would be why someone might choose to take a gap year or two. One kind of perk about taking two gap years instead of one is that if you're doing this to either help you make your decision or because you need more research experience, if you take just one gap year, you would just be starting that experience at the same time that you're submitting your application. So you really haven't used that experience to help make your decision, or you won't actually have more experience by the time you apply. If you take two gap years, you're able to have a full year of that experience before you're submitting your application. I'm not saying you need to take two. Again, it's all such a personal decision, but it's just something to think about when you're looking at those options. What should you do during gap years? So I know for medical school, there's a lot of options, a lot of different types of things are discussed. But for MD PhD programs, really the main answer is something involving research. If you're telling us that you want to spend your life doing this, we want to see that in the opportunities that you choose during your gap year. And so there's a lot of different ways you can get that research experience. Most of these pay you, and I think that's really important. So you can work as a research assistant in a lab. You can work at a place like Vanderbilt where you are working as a research assistant. I'm sure many of you have research assistants that you've interacted with throughout the summer in your summer experiences. Those are essentially jobs that pay you to do research and to get more experience. I think one thing that is important if you're a research assistant is that your PI, your faculty member you're working with, knows that you want to go to graduate school or MD PhD programs. And we'll also make sure that you work on a project and you have some research opportunities that are developing projects in the lab rather than simply working as a like lab manager where you're doing something like the genotyping for the lab and the ordering and the PCR, but you're not actually working on a research project. You'll have to do a lot of that management and coordination. That's part of it, right? That's what they hired you to do. So that's okay, but you don't want to only be doing that if possible, because that's not really letting you get that experience in research the same way. Another really great experience is the National Institute of Health has a postbac program. It's called IRTA, which I think means intramural research training something appointment maybe. And this is another way that you get experience. It's essentially 1 to 2 year positions where you get paid to work in a lab at the National Institute of Health. They have a lot of really great resources for their postbacks. They do a lot of workshops and training and support, and so it's a really great experience to do research but also get advice on applying to programs and things like that. There's also additional programs you might have heard about called PrEP. Vanderbilt has a PrEP program, um, or Fulbright experiences, different things that might come with courseworks or scholarships or things like that. And these types of things are, usually have to apply for as well, and they're often funded. And those can be great experiences too. If you're thinking about anything that might involve you being away internationally, I think one thing to consider with the timing of that is, if you're applying during that year and you're going to be interviewing during that year, there might be, you might have to come back for interviews sometimes. And so just thinking about what that could look like. I think next year most programs are going to be doing virtual interviews still, but in the future, we don't know exactly what that will look like. And so it's something you just want to plan for. There are other programs that are sometimes master's programs or like post-bac programs that you have to pay for. So all of the previous opportunities are all funded. You get paid to do them, which is awesome. The only time that I might recommend something like a master's or a post-bac program is if you need to improve your GPA. So if you feel like you have a GPA that is not competitive and you want to show through additional coursework that you can do well in more advanced coursework, and you think that's something that you need in order to succeed in an application process, then that might be some time that you might consider one of these paid programs that provides you the opportunity to gain additional coursework. But I think if that's not the case, then all of these programs that pay you are certainly the types of things to consider. So the next thing that I talked a little bit about just now is the academic preparation. So what we're really looking at here is what is your potential for success in medical school? How are you going to show us that you have the ability to succeed in our medical school curriculum, a little bit also the graduate school coursework as well. And so we'll look at your MCAT score. So you need to take the MCAT. You don't typically need the GRE for MD-PhD programs, just the MCAT. We will look at your GPA and we'll look at your courses that you've taken, and kind of evaluate all of that together. If your GPA is, lower than you think it should be or lower than ranges of accepted students or averages, some things that we'll look at are improvement over time. How, sometimes it's common that freshman year GPAs are lower than junior or senior GPAs because you have a transition to college. It's it's harder than high school, you didn't have appropriate study habits, or just even being away from maybe home or your family was really challenging. And that's common. And so we'll look at that. We'll look at how you might have improved over time and um, what that looked like for you. We'll also look at your explanations. So if you had a particular semester or a particular year that was really difficult for you, and there's a reason why, maybe you were overcommitted or there was something going on personally during that time, or you learned afterwards how to study better because of that challenge. Tell us about that. Tell us how you overcame whatever challenges there were, how you picked up skills that will be helpful, how you'll be able to get through those same types of challenges in medical school, and what will lead to your success. I mentioned before the idea of these master's programs, or additional post-bac coursework. Those things can potentially be helpful. Um, One thing that I listed here, just we get these questions a lot, what are the ranges of GPA and MCAT for accepted students? So Vanderbilt, the MCAT range is typically around 77% and above. That can vary from year to year. That is not like a cutoff. That's just that range for accepted students. Um, and like I said, that can vary a bit from year to year. The GPA range that I've listed is also around 3.2, and I put ish because sometimes it's a little lower or a little higher, but that's usually roughly the lower end of the range, and above. Um, if we One other question that we get a lot is if you have multiple MCAT scores, what does that look like? And this differs a lot based on schools. Some schools will look at the average of the scores. Some schools will only look at your best or your most recent score. It really can vary. Vanderbilt actually looks at what we call a super score. So we will look at your highest individual section scores, to create a super score, like the best possible score for you. And that's the score that we will consider. So that's really helpful as well if you've had to take the MCAT more than once. I saw a related question here in the chat, so I'm just going to address that right now. Someone said, do you find that the GPA and MCAT scores are higher for the MSDP program students than for the med school as a whole? I think this can vary again at individual institutions, but at Vanderbilt, they're not higher. I would say they're very similar, um, and about the same. Sometimes our MSTP is maybe even like a point lower on the MCAT. And part of that is that we are really interested in your research experience, right? That's super important to us. We want people who we think are going to be extremely successful physician scientists, and that's the most important criteria. And so sometimes that can help overcome someone who might have had a slightly lower GPA or MCAT if that research and motivation for the program and the career was really strong. I just wanted to show this. This is actually national data, so this is not Vanderbilt specific. Um, but this is from last, I guess it's like 2 years ago now, application cycle. So students who entered programs last summer. We don't yet have this data completed for people who would enter programs this summer and fall. But this is the national applicant pool and matriculants for the MD-PhD programs. And so you can see the mean and the ranges of the MCAT and GPA in the applicants, but then you can see the mean and ranges of the MCAT and GPA for the matriculants. So it's certainly higher for the matriculants, but another thing that we like to point out is that the ranges are very broad. So you might look at these means, and being near the mean is great and something you should try to do if possible. But if that's not you, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have no chance of getting into an MD PhD program. You can see the ranges are quite variable, and the lower ends of the ranges are much lower than the MCAT and GPA, sorry, than the mean. And the reason for that is that all programs really do a great job of holistic review, meaning that they look at everybody's application, all pieces, in terms of their individual background and experiences and opportunities. And they look at, the things that I mentioned, how you might have improved over time, what other qualities you're going to bring. And so it's not just about GPA and MCAT. There's a lot that goes into the review of your application. So these are, as I mentioned, the national, every person who applied and matriculated to MD PhD programs from the application cycle 2 years ago. It's not letting me move forward. Let's see here. Okay, try that again. All right. So I've talked about research and academics. What are some other things that programs will look at? At Vanderbilt, we look at what we call leadership potential. And I think a lot of schools look at a version of this. Our mission is to train leaders and people who will be leaders in medicine and research. That's the mission of the medical school and of the MSDP at Vanderbilt. We want to train people who are going to help move medical knowledge forward, who are going to be leaders in their field someday. And we give them experiences to be leaders in our program. And we think that's really important to help develop their skills. But we want to bring people in who are excited about that, who are going to be on our student committees and student organizations, who are going to help make our program better and help improve, the experience for students at Vanderbilt. And we're going to look at your application to see if you've shown us that you are someone who is potentially, likely to be interested in those types of things. And so this is how we'll evaluate your extracurricular activities, some of your service, the different types of things that you've done. It doesn't have to mean that you're involved in science and medicine organizations only. We like well balanced, well rounded people. And you don't also have to have been the president of an organization in order to have been a leader or show leadership potential. It's more about showing that you are excited about being involved in your campus and your community. And when you see a need or a problem, you're interested in giving back and making a difference. And so that's how we'll look at some of your extra things that you've done. And we'll look at that leadership potential. We also are going to look for clinical or medical exposure. So you're not just going to, grad school, you're going to medical school as well. And so we really want to know that you want to be a physician, that you enjoy working with patients, that you've had that experience, you enjoy helping patients, and you know what a physician's job and career looks like. So there's a lot of ways that we can look at this, and we'll look sort of at the sum of your experiences. So some people have shadowing, physician shadowing, some people have volunteering or clinical service experiences. Some people work as an EMT or a CNA or a scribe or a lot of different experiences. I know with all of these things that we've talked about, but particularly this one, COVID has certainly interrupted the opportunity to get clinical experience. And so we'll understand that for, a period of a year plus, a year and a half, maybe even, who knows, um, you likely haven't had a lot of experience shadowing or volunteering in a clinical setting. Vanderbilt has not let students shadow, and I don't know when they will be able to again. And so we certainly understand that. And so you be creative and think about all of the ways that you have learned about being a physician or a physician scientist and why that is something that you want to do. Hopefully, in the fall or sometime over this next year, these opportunities will become slightly more available than they are. Um, and we will certainly be flexible in how we evaluate this on applications. Oops. Another thing that we'll look at is your letters of recommendation. So you should have letters of recommendation from almost all of your research advisors. Sometimes you might not have them from everybody because there was someone you did research with like 5 years ago and it was only a couple of months or a summer and you haven't really kept in touch and you need to prioritize how many letters you have, so you didn't include that one. That's okay. But you should definitely have letters from most of your recent and substantial longitudinal research experiences. We want to hear from those people because that's a really great way for us to understand how you did in the lab and how likely you are to do well in our program. We also want to hear from your letter writers how you're going to be as a physician scientist, what your aptitude for that career is like. And that doesn't just mean a physician or a doctor, but that's the scientist part of it as well. And so make sure your letter writers know that you're applying to MD PhD programs and that this is your goal so that they talk about your potential for success as a physician scientist rather than just in medical school and as a doctor. And I think that's really important at schools where you might not have a lot of people applying to MD PhD programs, because they might just think medical school. And so letting, really being clear with your advisors and your letter writers about your career goals, what you're planning to do, and what type of programs you're applying to will allow them to write the best letter for the type of programs that you're applying to. Another thing that we're going to heavily evaluate is, why do you want to do this, right? As I mentioned earlier, we don't want to spend all this time and money training someone who really should have just gone to either medical school or graduate school in the first place. We are going to look a lot at why do you want to do MD PhD? Do you know what it means to do an MD PhD program? What does a physician scientist career look like? So make sure you're exploring the opportunities that you have to talk to students, to talk to faculty, and to learn what does this really look like so that when you write about it in your essays and answer questions about it in your interview, you are knowledgeable about the pathway. You don't want us to wonder if you really know what you're getting into, because then that's going to definitely be make us less likely to accept you and to pursue your opportunities for our program. So make sure you spend time, fleshing this out for yourself and learning what this looks like. I just included some things here at the bottom about sort of the intangible things that we'll look for. We'll look at your essays and your interview to try to gauge some of these types of characteristics. We want people who are motivated and independent and curious and creative and will persist through the tough times, have teamwork, can work with others, and are really going to be people that we think are going to make a difference in our program and in their future careers. And so we'll look at all of those types of characteristics in your application and, as I mentioned, in your interview. So speaking of interviews, um, what do MD PhD program interviews look like? So all those things I discussed are things that we will use to evaluate your application, but they're also things that we're going to learn more about during the interview process. These interviews are often a mix of what you might find in an MD interview and a PhD interview. Some programs you'll end up going to like an MD only interview day, like the medical school interview and the admissions committee process, and also an MD PhD specific day. Some programs will kind of combine those experiences. Sometimes you'll have different types of interview formats. So medical schools will do things called multiple mini interviews. You'll sometimes have chalk talks or panel interviews. There's a lot of different formats that you can have. For Vanderbilt, we have just one kind of MD PhD interview that you do, and that qualifies for the medical school and the PhD part. During that interview, you meet with about 5 to 7 people that include a member of our MSTP leadership team, a couple members of our MSTP admissions subcommittee, a senior MSTP student, as well as faculty whose research interests you. And we will ask you to tell us which faculty you'd like to meet with. And oftentimes the admissions committee members and the students should also will be people who match your research interests if possible. All of those interviews are one-on-one meetings. They all have access to your application. Some schools will have some interviews where they don't actually read your application beforehand, but all of ours have access to your application and will read it and ask you questions about it, hopefully. And then they're all kind of like open-ended interviews where they're just going to ask you questions and have conversations. There's no fancy formats for our interviews. Something that is really important is that you do your homework about the school, the program, the people you're meeting with, that you ask them questions that are relevant to their role in the program, to the research that they do. You, especially the faculty who you have asked to meet with, you should certainly be interested in their research. So you should be asking them questions. And even the ones you didn't ask to meet with, find out who they are and what they do so that you are knowledgeable in your interview. A lot of these interviews are going to be about your research. They're going to ask you to discuss your research in detail. They're going to ask you questions about future directions and what to do if something didn't work. They might even ask you about something about their research. And you should certainly, as I mentioned, ask them about their research. So be prepared to discuss that in detail. Talk to people who might not be familiar with what you do in order to practice for the interview so that you can really communicate your research well. One thing also that is important about these is sometimes these interviews are maybe 2 or 3 days. You come and you get to explore the city and you get to have dinner with students and you get to do a lot of fun things. Unfortunately, last year and this next year, they're going to be on Zoom, so it's a little bit different. But I think a thing to remember is that, the second you step off the plane or you log onto Zoom, um, everything that you're doing has the potential to be evaluated. So you want to be on essentially your best behavior, right? The interviews is that whole experience, not just when you're meeting one on one with faculty. You want to treat the students well, you want to treat each other well, you want to treat the faculty and the staff that you're working with well, because that whole thing is an evaluation process. And you should keep that in mind that until you get back on that plane or you log off Zoom, that this is all part of the interview experience. These are just some statistics nationally that I wanted to share with you. Again, this is across the country. And these are again about a year old because we don't yet have data for the new classes yet. But there are about 5,500 MD-PhD trainees across the country nationally. In the application cycle from 2 years ago, um, and again, the people who would have matriculated in the summer of 2020, there were about 1,825 applications compared to about 50,000 straight medical school applications. So it's a much smaller application pool. Um, um, the applicants end up submitting about 14 applications per person. So they apply to about 14 different schools on average. And out of these 1,825 applicants, about 700 of them matriculated. And so we say there's roughly a third, I think it's actually a little bit higher than that, but of applicants will enter into an MD PhD program. And this is actually very similar to the number of people who enter into medical school from the straight MD applicant pool as well. And I think that's important because as someone alluded to with their question about GPA and MCAT too, it's often thought that MD PhD programs are so much more competitive to get into. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think those metrics like GPA and MCAT can be similar at institutions. The percentage of applicants who get into programs is actually pretty similar. And so I don't want people to think that this is a harder path. It's really just, it's a different path. It's different career goals and a different path for people that want to pursue a different career. Of those 700 matriculants, about half of them were women, which is really great. This number actually, I think this might have been the first year that this was actually over 50%. And we have seen the number of women apply and matriculate into these programs um, increase over the last 5 to 10 years. And that's something that we're really excited about. We also list here the number of students who are categorized as underrepresented in science and medicine based on their race and ethnicity. And we also include this multi-race and ethnicity background because currently the data we get from AMCAS doesn't break this down into people who might have more than one category. And so this number of underrepresented students is probably a little bit higher, but it's certainly not high enough. And so all the programs are working hard to make sure that we can, increase programs or increase the number of underrepresented students in our program and in the training pathway as a whole, with the idea that, of course, we want a more diverse group of career physician scientists. So that's something that we are certainly looking at the national level as well. This is last year's, yes, okay. This is at Vanderbilt, but these are the new students who actually just started this summer. So these people started about a month ago with a lab rotation, and now they are in like their first week of medical school or second week of medical school. And this is what then last year's application cycle looked like. So we had received 609 applications last year. That was an increase of about 100 applications from the year before. And we're currently seeing an increase this current cycle compared to where we were last year at this time too. So that is exciting to hear. One challenge is that we don't just, automatically increase the number of spots available. So it does get a bit more competitive, unfortunately. But medical schools also saw this same increase. It wasn't specific to MD PhD programs. In our program, we invite all applicants to submit a secondary application. So this is the number that of those 609, we had 544 who completed them. And we don't review any applications until we received your completed secondary, your letters of recommendation, your MCAT scores, everything. Then we review your applications and we'll invite people to interview. We invited 115 people to interview, and then 107 of those actually completed an interview. So sometimes people will start getting a lot of interview invitations or have been accepted to a program that they really want to go to, and so they'll decline their interview invitation. So we actually interviewed 107 people last year, and we admitted 50 people in order to have a class size of 16. And so this number admitted was a little bit higher than previous years, but we also had virtual interviews last year. And so I think it was just a bit challenging for everybody. People weren't able to visit campus before making a decision. And so that was, I think, tough for applicants to decide if that was a place they want to attend. It sounds like most MD PhD programs are doing virtual interviews this year. One thing that we're hoping is that there's always a second visit usually in March or April for all applicants who've been accepted to a program. And most programs are really hoping that we can have in-person second visits. And that seems like that might be likely, but of course we just don't yet know what will happen with COVID. So our incoming class size, as I mentioned, we're trying to get 16 students. That's what we accepted or matriculated this past year, and that's what we're hoping for next year as well. We have grown our program a bit over the last few years, and we're currently in like the fifth through eighth or so largest program in the country. Our incoming class breakdown was of 9 men, 7 women, and we work hard on trying to maintain gender balance as much as possible, and 3 students from backgrounds that are underrepresented in science and medicine. I just wanted to put this here. This is another slide from kind of the National MD PhD Program Committee. But I just wanted to see you to see the timeline of these things. So it takes multiple years to decide and prepare to apply to MD PhD programs, to get all of these experiences that you need. And then you're going to start preparing your application a year and a half or so before you actually think you're going to apply. In that summer before you're going to start applying, you're going to interview over the fall and winter. Sometime over the winter, you're going to be accepted to programs, and then you're going to matriculate in the summer or the fall. And so this is a long process. It's longer than PhD programs for sure. And it's something that definitely takes a lot of thought and time to prepare for. One other quick thing I wanted to cover is, eventually you're going to be accepted to these programs, and you're probably going to have a choice of programs. And so, what types of things should you think about if you're deciding which type of program or which program to go to? And these are just some things to consider. So, you certainly want to think about the research environment. What types of research opportunities are there in your area of interest? You generally don't want to go to a program because there's only one lab there that interests you and you must work in that lab. Because if that faculty member were to just have a full lab at that time, maybe not have great funding at that time, or not be taking new students, or sometimes even faculty members will leave and go to different institutions. You don't want to be banking your entire reason for picking that program on one faculty member. So we really encourage you to think about, are there multiple people here who I'd like to work with? What are the core facilities? What are the types of environment like at this program? Also think about the academic environment. What is the medical school curriculum like? What types of integration is there amongst the training? What is the support like for students? What is that whole climate like at this institution? And is this where I think I will thrive? What are the current students like? Are those people that you see yourself, being involved with? What are the activities and the professional development experiences that the program has? All programs are going to have a whole list of ways that they train their students, and you're going to want to know, are these the types of things that you think you'll benefit from? What are the alumni doing, and do those career outcomes match what you think you want to do in your future? You are going to live in this school area for 7 to 8 years. So is this a place you want to live in? I know that that shouldn't maybe be like the only thing you're considering, but it certainly is important that you're going to be happy, and you're going to be able to live a satisfying life during this time as well. So thinking about that. Um, and then just, how well do you think that you belong and you fit with the program? Is this somewhere that you really see yourself? And we think that's certainly an important piece of criteria as well. Um, so I just listed some resources here. So if you want to know more, I think a great website is this MDPhD website from AAMC. And if you just Google like AAMC MDPhD, you'll get there. They have a lot of resources for applicants that are being updated all the time. So that's something to think about. We kind of mentioned talking to students and faculty, and hopefully, if you haven't seen all these virtual VSSA talks, please go back and look at the recordings, because I think really hearing from people doing this pathway is really valuable. And then also asking about the people who people who are doing this, people who care about you, your lab mentors, directors of your summer programs, professors that you meet, advisors at your school and in your summer program, MD-PhD program directors and administrators, all of the people who can give you advice. And don't ever hesitate to reach out for advice to MD-PhD program administration and students, that might be at Vanderbilt or institutions that you're at or near where you're at as well. Feel free to email if you have questions in the future. We'd be happy to help. And I've mentioned this before, but we do have a monthly newsletter. It's just once a month that it comes out, so it's not something that's going to clutter your inboxes, but I think it's a really great way to learn about the Vanderbilt MSDP and what is going on in our program and what our students are up to, and learn about student life. We do post all of our newsletter stories for the most part on a blog on our website. And then we also have some social media accounts as well that we'd love to have you follow us and stay engaged and in touch with our program. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I know we've got just a few minutes left, or you can unmute yourself or raise your hand or something like that, and I'm happy to answer questions out loud as well. But I can stay a little bit past the time too if we go long. I do see one question in the chat that says, does admitted mean acceptances and people who matriculated actually choose Vanderbilt? Um, so I think I think that hmm. So when we're looking at like the slide with the numbers of GPA and MCAT, sorry, I'm going back. Okay, maybe this slide. This slide is not about Vanderbilt specifically. This is about national programs. Um, and so this is about something that is like all of the people applied to any program, and the matriculants are the people who actually went into MD PhD programs. When I don't remember where it was, but somewhere I told you these are the ranges for MCATs and GPA of students who were accepted to Vanderbilt in the last few years, but those were not actually necessarily students who chose Vanderbilt. I wanted to give you a broader range because these programs are small, and it's hard to really, if we only sometimes look at who came here, it can sometimes limit those numbers a little bit. So let me know if that answered your question. If not, feel free to elaborate on that question. Someone said, how are non-science research experiences viewed? So a little bit of that depends on what type of program you want to go into for your PhD. So if you want to go into a biomedical science PhD program, then it's really important that you have science-related research experiences. If you are interested in a more humanities or social sciences type PhD program, then we would expect you to have some experiences that are in that area. Now, Vanderbilt doesn't have humanities or social sciences options. We do have a couple of public health PhDs like epidemiology and health policy. And so, if you're interested in those PhD programs, then you certainly should have experiences that align more closely with that type of work. But it's research experience is great, but if you're saying you want to do something in science and engineering or biomedical sciences, having some type of research in a related field is certainly what we're going to be looking for. So a lot of advisors have said that the MD personal statement should be more like a life story narrative. Is this the same with MD PhD essay, or should that be more of an informative type of essay listing reasons why you want the dual degree? Um, it should. I think all of your essays should be more like stories or narratives. Maybe the research experience one it doesn't always work as well, but they're essays, so we want to hear an essay, not a list. That's kind of the design of them. So the MD PhD essay should be a narrative that explains why this is the path for you. It's shorter, so you don't have as much room to work with, but it certainly should be you know, more than a list, if that makes sense. Someone said, oh, and this is a good question because I forgot to talk about publications more about whether they're necessary and what that looks like. But someone asked what programs are looking at publication. When programs are looking at publications, does it matter whether it's actually published or in review? So one note about publications is that publications are not required. MD PhD programs like to see some sort of productivity in research sometimes, but that can be a lot of different things. That can sometimes be um, that can sometimes be like your presentations that you'll do. It can be publications that are in the works. It can be maybe a letter writer explaining to us that your data was really great and is in the future going to be contributed to a publication, or maybe your data went into one of their grant applications. We like to see that your research has gone somewhere, but we also realize that there are often a lot of challenges in research, and sometimes undergraduates are given projects that aren't always as likely to work out, and sometimes they just don't work out, right? And so we certainly understand that. Another thing is that some students will uh, different labs have essentially different criteria in how you can be put on a publication or contributed as an author. And so those are things that we'll think about as well. So publications are not required. They can be great if you've got them, and having something that's under in review or close to submission is also really exciting, and we love to hear about those things. So it doesn't always have to be a final publication, but that's where if your publication is ultimately accepted, we'd love to hear about it through an update. So someone says, is it possible to look at the AMCAS application months in advance to pre-draft essays? So you can't actually like start working on your AMCAS application until May, but AMCAS has a really substantial guide available that explains like everything they're going to ask you, what the essays are like, all of the things that they're going to want to know. And so you can certainly read that ahead of time. Start working on your personal statement and your other essays. Start thinking about your experiences that you're going to list. What are you going to say for all of those? You can definitely do the homework well ahead of time to get that information available. And on their website, they have a lot of information and a really nice like PDF guide to the application. So you can look at that ahead of time for sure. You just can't put anything in the online system until the May of the year you want to apply. So these are the people. So this the follow up to the question about kind of the people that are this year's matriculants. So this 50 people admitted, this year in our program. 16 people were the amount that actually came to Vanderbilt, and then this is the breakdown of them. So we accepted 50, hoping to get 16, and this is what the 16 people looked like. I'm not sure if I still answered your question, And we are not right now, we don't share just like the individual kind of breakdown of each class, because it is only 16 people in terms of like GPA and MCAP, and we want to keep a little bit of privacy amongst the people. And so we share kind of the general, like what over the last few years the MCATs and GPAs have looked like, rather than each individual class, just because it's not a large group of people. And so we don't want anyone to, there to be any privacy or anything like that broken down. Any other questions? Either in the chat or feel free to just ask. I'll just chat for a minute. But thank you all for coming today and or watching online if that's what you're doing. And like I said, if you have questions in the future, we are happy to help. Please reach out to programs, program directors, students. People want to help you be successful and know what it takes to get into these types of programs. So don't ever hesitate to ask or think that no one wants to help you or to talk to you about that. That's certainly what the programs want to do. So thank you all for being here. If there are no more questions, feel free to enjoy the rest of your summer, and um, I'm happy to connect with you all in the future. So thank you, everybody.
Check out our website to find recordings of all of our videos. We'll get them posted about a week after each of the presentations. We can't wait to see you!